The divorce papers made less noise than the rain. Elena Moretti slid them across the black walnut desk at 11:52 on a Thursday night, and for 3 full seconds the most feared man in Chicago did nothing at all. Luca Moretti had been signing death warrants with a fountain pen when she walked into his study. He wore a charcoal suit with no tie, the first 2 buttons of his white shirt open, his sleeves rolled once at the wrist. Beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, Lake Michigan was a sheet of black steel under the storm. Lightning flashed far enough away that the sound arrived late. His gaze dropped from Elena's face to the document between them. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Her signature was already at the bottom. His expression did not change. That frightened her more than anger would have. "You used my name," he said. She almost laughed. "It is my name." "No." His eyes moved to the signature again. Elena Hale. That one. The name she had been born with. The name she had not written in almost 3 years. Elena folded her arms because if she didn't, he might see her hands shaking. "I thought it was appropriate. For a divorce." "Yes." Luca leaned back slowly. The room seemed to arrange itself around his silence. On the other side of the study doors stood men who would cross the city at 2 in the morning if he lifted one finger. Judges returned his calls. Police captains forgot what they had seen. Businessmen who laughed at senators stopped laughing when Luca Moretti entered a room. But Elena had seen him feverish from a bullet wound. She had seen him fall asleep sitting in a chair beside her bed after she had pneumonia. She had seen him carry a frightened 6-year-old out of a restaurant during a shooting and hand the child to his mother without ever telling anyone he had taken a round through his coat to do it. She knew there were 2 versions of him. That was part of the problem. "When?" he asked. "When what?" "When did you decide?" "Tonight." "That's a lie." Her jaw tightened. "You don't get to interrogate me." "I know when you're lying. You know when I tap my thumb against my ring finger. You know I turn on the hallway light when I can't sleep. You know I order tea and forget to drink it when I'm worried." Her voice grew sharper with every word. "Apparently, you know which grocery store I stop at, which route I take to the hospital foundation, how long I spend at my sister's grave, what books I buy, who I speak to in the lobby, and whether I close the curtains before I change clothes." For the first time, something moved behind Luca's eyes. Not guilt. Recognition. Elena reached into the pocket of her coat and threw a small brass key onto the desk. It spun once between them, then stopped. "I found the room." Luca did not look at the key. "Elena, don't. You should not have been down there." A cold, humorless laugh escaped her. "That is your defense?" "It is not a defense. There were photographs of me on the walls." "I know." "From before our wedding." "I know." "Before I ever treated you in the ER." He said nothing. Her eyes burned, but she refused to cry in front of him. She had done enough crying alone in bathrooms, in stairwells, in the guest room she had started sleeping in 2 weeks ago. "There were surveillance reports dated 6 months before we met," she whispered. "You knew what time I left work. You knew where I lived. You knew my father's name. You knew about my sister. You knew everything." Luca's face hardened in that familiar way, as if emotion were a door he could bolt from the inside. "And then one night you arrived at my hospital bleeding," Elena continued. "You let me believe it was chance. You let me believe I saved a stranger. You let me believe that everything after that, every threat, every bodyguard, the marriage, happened because I happened to be in the wrong room at the wrong time." Lightning flashed again. This time the thunder came closer. "Was any of it real?" she asked. Luca's voice was quiet. "Yes." "Which part?" His jaw flexed. "That's what I thought." She pushed the papers another inch toward him. "Sign them." He looked at her for a long moment, then he picked up his pen. Elena's chest tightened, surprised by the pain of getting what she had asked for, but Luca did not sign. He capped the pen. "No?" She stared at him. No? No. You don't get to say no. I just did. Something hot snapped through her fear. I am not one of your businesses. I am not a territory you can defend. I am not a contract you can refuse to terminate because the terms are inconvenient. I know exactly what you are. Do you? His eyes lifted to hers. The way he looked at her had always been the most dangerous thing about him. Not because it was cruel, because it was too focused. Luca could stand in a ballroom filled with 200 people and somehow make Elena feel like every door, every light, every breath in the building had narrowed to the space between them. She hated that her pulse still responded. She hated him for knowing it probably did. You asked me once, Luca said, what I would do if you wanted to leave. I remember. I told you I would open the door myself. And now, his gaze flicked toward the windows. Now you picked the worst possible night to test whether I meant it. Elena went still. What does that mean? Luca glanced at the antique clock on the mantel. 11:58. He pressed a button beneath his desk. The study doors opened immediately. His head of security, Gabriel Russo, stepped inside. Broad-shouldered, gray at the temples, expression carved from stone. Boss? Where is Nico? Luca asked. South Gate. Bring him inside. Gabriel's gaze moved once to the papers on the desk, then away. Luca continued. Double the men at the lower drive. No vehicles leave without my approval. Elena's stomach dropped. Luca. He ignored her. Cut the estate's external network. Switch security to closed circuit. I want every guard physically verified. Gabriel nodded. Understood. And Gabriel? The older man paused. At midnight, lock the house. Elena stared at him. Gabriel's expression did not move, but a pulse beat once in his jaw. Including the private exits? Every exit. Luca, what are you doing? His eyes returned to her. Keeping you alive. Gabriel disappeared into the corridor. Elena rounded the desk. You don't get to make this dramatic because I asked for a divorce. This has nothing to do with your papers. You just ordered your men to lock me inside the house. I ordered them to lock everyone inside. That is not better. No, Luca said. It isn't. She reached the door. He did not touch her. He didn't have to. Elena. She stopped because of his tone. Do not go near an exterior door. She turned. Or what? For 1 second, Luca Moretti looked less like a mafia boss than a man listening for a sound only he could hear. Or someone may shoot you through it. The lights went out. Darkness swallowed the room. A mechanical boom rolled through the mansion as steel shutters slammed over the first-floor windows. Somewhere below them, heavy locks engaged one after another. Click, click, click. The sound traveled through the house like a countdown. Elena looked at the luminous face of the mantel clock. 12:02. Exactly 10 minutes after she had asked Luca Moretti for a divorce, every exit was locked. Then a gunshot cracked through the east wing. Luca moved before Elena understood the sound. He crossed the room in 2 strides, caught her around the waist, and drove them both behind the stone fireplace as a second shot shattered something in the corridor. His body covered hers. His hand cradled the back of her head, holding her face against his chest. Stay down. She heard footsteps outside, men shouting, Gabriel's voice sharp and controlled. Luca drew a pistol from the back of his waistband. Elena looked at it, then at him. You knew. I suspected. You knew this was going to happen. No. His eyes were cold now, battle calm. I knew someone expected you to leave the house at midnight. The words landed harder than the gunshots. What? Before he could answer, the study doors burst open. Gabriel appeared with 2 armed men. Shooter is down. One of ours. Luca's face became terrifyingly blank. Name. Patrick Doyle. 6 years on the payroll. Target? Gabriel looked at Elena. He fired at the corridor outside the study. We found a suppressed weapon and a photo of Mrs. Moretti in his jacket. Elena felt the blood drain from her face. Luca stood, but he kept himself between her and the doorway. "Alive?" he asked. "For now." "I want him breathing." Gabriel nodded. "Seal the basement tunnels," Luca said. "Nobody uses an elevator. Search every room. Take phones from everyone, including family." A voice behind Gabriel said, "You cannot be serious." Vittorio Moretti stepped into view. Luca's uncle was 60, silver-haired, elegant, and old-fashioned enough to wear a vest with his suit. He had been Luca's father's consigliere before Luca inherited the organization at 28. Vittorio had taught Luca how to shoot, how to negotiate, how to identify a liar by watching which direction his eyes moved. He had also toasted Elena at her wedding. "What happened?" Vittorio asked. "Someone tried to kill my wife." Vittorio glanced at Elena. "Then she should be taken to the panic room." "No. That is what it exists for. That is where they will expect me to put her." Vittorio's brows lifted slightly. "They?" Luca's gaze turned glacial. "So someone inside this house knew my wife intended to leave tonight." Elena stopped breathing. Vittorio's eyes dropped to the divorce papers visible on the desk, only for a second. But Luca noticed. He noticed everything. The room became silent. Elena looked from one man to the other. "I told no one." Luca did not take his eyes off his uncle. "No one?" "No one." "Your attorney?" "She emailed the documents to an encrypted address. I printed them myself in the library." "Who knew the password?" "No one." "Who knew you found the surveillance room?" "No one." Vittorio gave a small sigh. This is not the time to turn a domestic disagreement into a conspiracy. Luca's gaze snapped to him. "Domestic disagreement? I saw the papers." "You saw a heading from 12 feet away." Vittorio's face changed almost imperceptibly. Luca stepped forward. "Go to the West Salon," he said. "Gabriel is collecting everyone. I have stood beside this family for 32 years, and tonight you will stand where I tell you." Vittorio's mouth tightened. Then he left. Elena turned on Luca the second the doors closed. "What did you mean someone expected me to leave at midnight?" He holstered his gun. "I received a message at 11:43. "From whom?" "Unknown number." "What did it say?" Luca's silence answered before he did. "Tell me." His eyes met hers. It said, "When Elena walks out tonight, do not follow. She belongs to Rinaldi now." The name made Elena's skin go cold. Matteo Rinaldi. Even people who pretended Chicago's old criminal families no longer existed knew the name. Hotels, construction, shipping, nightclubs, 2 city councilmen who always seemed to vote his way. Rinaldi had spent the last 2 years circling Luca's territory like a shark waiting for blood. Elena had never met him. At least that was what she had been told. "You got that message before I entered the study?" she asked. "Yes." "And you said nothing?" "You were already angry." "That is your explanation?" "I needed to know whether the message was real." "So you let me ask for a divorce while you were testing me?" His expression tightened. "I was not testing you." "It feels exactly like that." "Elena, somebody knew what you were going to do before you did it." "I decided this afternoon." "Then somebody has been close enough to you to know your decision within hours." Her stomach twisted. She thought of the hidden room again, the photographs, the reports, the maps marked with her routes, and suddenly the house did not feel like Luca's fortress. It felt like a glass box where everyone had been watching her. "Maybe the person close enough is you," she said. He went very still. "Maybe there is no message." Luca reached into his jacket and handed her his phone. The screen was open to a single text. "Unknown sender, 11:43 p.m. When Elena walks out tonight, do not follow. She belongs to Rinaldi now. Below it was a photograph. Elena standing in the library 3 hours earlier, divorce papers spread on the table. The image had been taken from inside the house. Behind her, reflected faintly in the dark window, was a figure she could not identify. She looked up. Luca was watching her face. "Still think I locked the doors because I can't hear the word divorce?" he asked. "Yes," she said, although her voice was smaller now. "Partly." Something almost like pain flashed across his expression. "Good," he said. "Stay angry. Angry people pay attention." He took the phone back. Elena hated that line because it sounded exactly like him. Cold, practical, impossible to argue with. She hated more that she believed him. A scream rose from somewhere downstairs. Luca's hand went to his gun. The study doors opened again. One of Gabriel's men stood there, breathing hard. "Boss, we found the east service door open." Luca's voice dropped. "I ordered every exit locked. It is locked now, but the alarm log shows it was opened manually at 11:57. Elena's pulse began to pound. 5 minutes after she entered the study, 5 minutes after she handed Luca the papers. "Anything else?" he asked. The guard looked at Elena, then back at Luca. "Yes." He held up a black silk scarf. Elena recognized it immediately. It had been missing from her closet for 2 days. "We found this outside the door," the guard said, "beside fresh tire tracks." Luca's eyes changed. The cold remained, but beneath it came something far worse. Fear. Not fear for himself, for her. Elena had lived with Luca Moretti for 3 years and had never seen that look on his face. He turned to Gabriel. "Move her!" "I am standing right here," Elena snapped. Luca looked at her. "Then listen carefully. Someone inside my house opened a door for men who came here expecting to take you. Someone had an item from your closet to make it look as if you left willingly. And someone knew about the divorce before I did." He stepped closer, not touching her, but blocking the hallway with his body. "Until I know who that person is, you do not leave my sight." Her heart kicked hard against her ribs. "That sounds like an order." "It is. I am still divorcing you." His gaze held hers. "Survive the night," Luca said. "Then you can hate me in the morning." Morning never came quietly to the Moretti house. It arrived behind bulletproof glass in a storm that turned the lake white at the edges, while armed men moved through the corridors and every member of Luca's inner circle sat under guard in the West Salon. Elena spent the first hour in the upstairs library with Luca standing by the door. Not sitting, not speaking, watching. She had changed out of her wet coat but still wore the navy dress she had put on for dinner, though dinner had never happened. Her wedding ring felt heavy on her hand. She considered removing it twice and stopped both times, angry at herself for caring whether he noticed. Of course he noticed. He noticed everything. At 1:14 a.m., Gabriel brought in a tray with coffee, tea, and sandwiches no one touched. "Doyle is awake," he said. Luca's gaze shifted. "Talking?" "Not to us." "Then he is talking to the wrong people." Elena looked up sharply. Luca caught the look and exhaled through his nose. "I am not going to torture him in front of you." That sentence is not as reassuring as you think. Gabriel looked like he wanted to disappear into the wallpaper. Luca said, "You wanted honesty." "I wanted a husband who did not keep a surveillance archive on me." "That too." Gabriel cleared his throat. "There is something else." He held out a clear evidence bag. Inside was a tiny wireless transmitter. "We found it beneath the library table where Mrs. Moretti printed the papers." Elena stared. "A bug?" "Audio only," Gabriel said. "Very short range. It transmitted to a receiver somewhere on the grounds. So somebody heard me on the phone with my attorney." "Possibly. I used headphones." "Then they heard your side of the conversation." Elena closed her eyes. She remembered pacing around the table at 4 that afternoon, whispering, "I need it done tonight. I can't spend another day pretending I don't know what he did." Someone had listened. Someone had known. Luca took the evidence bag. Who had access to this room? Household staff? Family? Security? Meaning everyone. Meaning whoever planted it knew the rotation. Luca looked toward the rain-black windows. What about the image of Elena? Taken from the upper gallery with a telephoto lens, the reflection in the window is too distorted for facial recognition. Height? Between 5'10" and 6'2". That narrows it down to half the men in the house. Gabriel nodded. "What did Doyle say before he stopped talking?" Luca asked. Gabriel hesitated. Elena noticed. "Say it," Luca ordered. "He said Mrs. Moretti was never supposed to be shot." The room went silent. Elena's fingers tightened around the arms of her chair. What was he supposed to do? Create panic. Drive you toward the east corridor. "Where the service door was open," Elena said. Gabriel nodded. "And the scarf was outside," she whispered. "Yes." A staged escape, a photograph of her with divorce papers, her own scarf outside an open door, tire tracks leading away. By dawn, everyone would have believed Elena Moretti had left her husband voluntarily, and if she vanished after that, people would say she had chosen it. Luca's hand closed around the evidence bag until the plastic crackled. Elena watched his knuckles whiten. "Who paid Doyle?" he asked. "We found $200,000 in a Cayman account opened 3 days ago. No sender." "Family?" "Still checking." "Do it faster." Gabriel gave him a look only a man who had known Luca since childhood would dare give. "We are." When Gabriel left, Elena stood. "I want to see the room." "No." "You knew that answer would make me more determined." "Yes." "Then save us both the argument." Luca's mouth tightened. "There are things in that room you do not understand. That is why I want to see them. Elena, either you take me there, or I wait until your back is turned. My back will not be turned. Do you plan to follow me into the bathroom too?" "If I have to." She stared at him. For the first time that night, the corner of his mouth almost moved. Almost. Elena hated that a tiny piece of her wanted to smile. She did not. "I am not joking." "Neither am I." She walked toward the door. Luca stepped into her path. He did not grab her. He never grabbed her when anger was between them. That restraint was one of the things that confused her most about him. A man capable of ordering violence with a sentence would stop a fraction of an inch from touching her if he thought she did not want it. "Move," she said. "No. You cannot protect me from information." His eyes darkened. "I can try." "That might be the most arrogant thing you have ever said." "No, it is not even in the top 10. She gave him a flat look. This time the almost smile appeared again, gone before she could decide whether she had imagined it. Then his expression changed. He looked tired. Not physically. Deeper than that. He reached into his pocket and took out the brass key she had thrown onto his desk. "You want the truth?" "Yes." "All of it?" "Yes." "You may hate me more afterward." "I don't think that is possible." Luca held her gaze. "You always underestimate me." He turned toward the door. The surveillance room was hidden 2 levels below the wine cellar behind a steel panel Elena had discovered because a housekeeper accidentally left a service key in the wrong lock. The night before, she had spent 12 minutes inside. 12 minutes had destroyed 3 years of marriage. Now Luca entered the code and opened the door. Rows of dark monitors lined one wall. Filing cabinets lined another. A map of Chicago took up the third, dotted with colored pins and strings linking addresses, names, companies, ports, judges, warehouses, clubs, and Elena. Her photographs occupied an entire section. Elena leaving St. Catherine's Hospital in scrubs, Elena carrying groceries through snow, Elena laughing with her sister Claire outside a coffee shop 2 weeks before Claire died, Elena at the cemetery, Elena asleep on a train with her head against the window, Elena walking into a bookstore, Elena standing outside her apartment with a paper bag of takeout, Elena before Luca. The sight hurt worse the second time. She walked closer. "What did you think I was?" Luca stayed by the door. "A target." "That is not what the files say." "They say subject." "Exactly." "Because I did not know whether you were involved." "In what?" He said nothing. Elena turned around. "You said all of it." Luca crossed to a filing cabinet, unlocked the bottom drawer, and removed a thin black folder. He placed it on the table. The first page held a photograph of Elena's father, Thomas Hale. He had been dead for 7 years. Elena stared at the image of the smiling man she remembered smelling like coffee and machine oil. "What does my father have to do with this?" "Everything." Her eyes lifted. Luca opened the folder. "Your father was not only an accountant for a freight company. He worked for Lakefront Logistics for 24 years. Lakefront Logistics was controlled by Matteo Rinaldi's father." Elena blinked. "No." "Yes." "He did payroll. He cleaned money." She stepped back as if the table had moved. "You are lying." "I wish I were. My father hated criminals, because by the end, he knew what they were." Luca slid another page toward her, bank transfers, corporate shells, shipping manifests, names she did not recognize. "Your father kept books for Rinaldi's organization," Luca said. "Then he discovered they were moving more than money through the port. He copied everything." "Elena," he continued quietly, "he tried to leave." Her throat tightened. "He died of a heart attack." Luca's silence was enough. "No." "I had the records reviewed by 3 independent people." "No." The paramedic report showed signs consistent with potassium poisoning. The hospital did not test for it. Elena's knees weakened. She gripped the table. "My father had a heart condition." "I know." "You don't know anything about him." "I know he drove a blue Buick until the transmission failed. I know he bought you a used microscope when you were 12 because you told him you wanted to become a doctor. I know after your mother died, he learned to braid Claire's hair by watching videos online. I know he called you every Sunday at 9 even when you were working night shifts." Elena looked at him, stunned. Luca stopped. "Too late." She understood. "You studied him." "Yes." "You studied me." "Yes." "Why?" "Because after he died, the ledger disappeared." "What ledger?" "The copy he made. Account numbers, judges, shell companies, names of police officers, routes through the port. Enough to collapse half of Rinaldi's empire and send the other half to prison." "I have never seen it." "I know that now." "Now?" Luca's jaw tightened. "When did you start watching me?" "February of 2023. 6 months before he appeared in her emergency room. Elena felt something inside her crack cleanly. "And when did you decide to marry me?" "After the shooting at the hospital." "Was that shooting about me?" "No." "Were you there because of me?" Luca did not answer quickly enough. Her breath caught. "Were you?" "I went to St. Catherine's because one of my men had been admitted under an alias. I knew you worked there." "I did not intend to meet you." "But you knew who I was when I walked into the trauma bay?" "Yes." Elena remembered that night with brutal clarity. A man had been brought in through the private ambulance entrance after midnight, a gunshot wound high in his shoulder, refusing to give his real name. 3 men in expensive suits had stood outside the curtain. Elena had looked at the patient and told him that if he did not stop trying to get off the gurney, she would sedate him herself. He had stared at her as if no one had spoken to him that way in years. Then he had smiled. Barely. She had thought it was the beginning. It had not been the beginning for him. How much of our first conversation did you already know the answers to? She asked. Luca looked at her. All of it, she whispered. No. Which questions? I did not know you hated olives. She almost slapped him. Maybe he saw it because he said, that was not a joke. That makes it worse. She turned away, blinking hard. Claire, she said. The room went still. Her sister had died in a car accident 4 months after Elena met Luca. A truck had crossed the median in the rain. The driver was never found. Elena slowly turned back. Was Claire's accident an accident? Luca's face told her before his voice did. We never proved otherwise. You suspected? Yes. And you didn't tell me? I had no evidence. You had enough to put men outside my apartment. Yes. You had enough to propose a fake marriage. Yes. But not enough to tell me my sister might have been murdered? His voice dropped. You were barely sleeping. You blamed yourself because she borrowed your car that night. That was my grief to carry. I know. No. You decided what I was allowed to know. I decided you were already being crushed by something I could not prove. You decided, yes. The word hit the room like a slap. At least he did not hide from it. Elena looked back at the wall of photographs. You married me because you thought I had my father's ledger. No. You just said, I watched you because of the ledger. I married you because Rinaldi's men started following you after Claire died. That is not better. I know. You could have told me. You would have run. You don't know that. Yes, I do. Stop saying you know me. Her voice cracked. Luca went silent. Elena's eyes filled despite everything she had promised herself. You know my schedule, she said. You know what tea I drink. You know what song I play when I clean the kitchen. You know the names of every person I have ever loved. But you never trusted me enough to tell me why I was in danger. He looked at her with an expression she had never seen in public, stripped of command. I trusted you, he said. No, you protected me. Those are not the same thing. That landed. She saw it land. Luca looked toward the photographs as if seeing the room through her eyes for the first time. Elena pulled the wedding ring from her finger. His gaze dropped immediately. The change in him was almost invisible, but the entire atmosphere of the room tightened. She placed the ring on top of her father's file. I want the divorce. Luca stared at the ring. For several seconds he did not breathe visibly. Then he reached past her, not for the ring, for the folder. He closed it beneath her hand. You will have it. Elena looked up. He was pale. What? You will have the divorce. She searched his face, suspicious even now. When this house is secure, I will sign whatever your attorney sends. The answer hurt so unexpectedly she almost hated him for that too. Just like that? No. His voice roughened. Not just like that. For one dangerous second, he lifted his hand as if he might touch her cheek. He stopped before his fingers reached her skin. His hand fell. But I told you once I would open the door if you wanted to leave. A muscle moved in his jaw. I lied to you about many things, Elena. I will not lie about that. A red light began blinking on one of the security consoles. Luca turned. An alarm sounded from above. Gabriel's voice came over the internal radio. Boss, we have movement in the south tunnel. Luca grabbed his gun. Elena's heart lurched. The tunnels were sealed. They were supposed to be. The steel door behind them slammed shut automatically. Then the lights inside the surveillance room switched from white to emergency red. On the central monitor, a security camera flickered to life. 3 men in black tactical gear moved through a concrete tunnel beneath the house. One carried a rectangular hard case. Another held a photograph. Even through the grainy feed, Elena recognized the face on it. Hers. Luca pressed the radio button. Gabriel, do not engage until you know how they got in. A burst of static answered, then a different voice came over the speaker, smooth, amused. "Good evening, Luca." Luca froze. Elena did not know the voice, but she knew the name before he said it. "Matteo," Luca replied. A soft laugh filled the room. "You locked every exit," Matteo Rinaldi said. "Very dramatic." Luca's face became stone. "You made one mistake, though." "What mistake?" "You assumed the person I wanted was trying to get out." The monitor changed. A new camera feed appeared. The West Salon. 20 people sat under guard. Family, staff, security. Vittorio was among them. Matteo's voice continued. "She was already exactly where I needed her." The feed cut to black. A second later, the steel door to the surveillance room unlocked by itself. Luca pushed Elena behind him. "Do not move." The door opened. No one stood there. Only a white envelope lay on the floor. Luca did not touch it. Elena did. "Elena, it has my name on it. That is precisely why you should not touch it." She opened it anyway. Inside was an old photograph. Claire, alive, standing beside a black Mercedes. The timestamp printed at the bottom was 2 weeks after the date Elena had buried her sister. Elena stopped breathing. On the back, someone had written 5 words. "Ask your husband who she became." Elena read the sentence twice because once was not enough for her mind to accept it. Then she looked at Luca. He had gone completely still. That was all the answer she needed. "You knew." "Elena, you knew." "Yes." The word emptied the room of air. She hit him. Her palm cracked across his face hard enough to turn his head. Luca did not raise a hand. He did not even step back. A red mark appeared slowly across his cheek. Elena's hand shook at her side. "My sister is alive?" His eyes returned to hers. "Yes." "How long?" "Since the night of the crash." The world tilted. Elena caught the edge of the desk. "You watched me bury her." "I watched you bury an empty casket." Her face twisted. "Don't say it like that." "I'm sorry." "You don't get to be sorry." "No." "You stood beside me at the cemetery." "Yes." "You held me while I cried." "Yes." "You let me think she was dead for 2.5 years." "Yes." Each answer was worse because he would not defend himself. Elena pushed away from the desk. "Where is she?" "I don't know." "You expect me to believe that?" "I knew where she was until 6 days ago." Elena froze. Luca's voice changed. The emotion disappeared again, locked behind command. "She missed a check-in." "What check-in?" "Claire contacted me after the crash. She had survived because she jumped from the car before it went into the ravine." Elena covered her mouth. "She knew the truck had been sent by Rinaldi," Luca continued. "She also knew why." "The ledger." "Yes." "My father gave it to her?" "No. He left her a key." "To what?" "A safe deposit box under a false name. Claire found the key hidden in an old music case at your father's house." Elena stared at him. "We sold everything after he died." "Not everything. Claire kept the violin he bought you when you were 13. Elena remembered. A scratched walnut case in Claire's apartment. Elena had hated violin lessons. Claire had loved listening to her practice anyway. "She found the key in the lining," Luca said. "She opened the box. The ledger was inside." "Why didn't she go to the police?" "She did." Elena's eyes widened. "An officer on Rinaldi's payroll called him before she made it out of the station." The room seemed suddenly much colder. "The crash happened that night," Luca said. Elena's knees nearly gave out. Luca moved toward her instinctively. She lifted a hand. "Don't touch me." He stopped at once. She hated him for obeying because part of her wanted him not to. "Claire called one person she knew Rinaldi hated enough to protect the ledger," Luca said. "You." "Yes." "And you hid her." I moved her through 3 safe houses in 48 hours. We staged the identification of the body using dental records supplied by a doctor I owned. Elena flinched at the word owned. She asked me not to tell you. You could have said no. I did. Elena looked up. I told her you had a right to know. She said if you knew she was alive, Rinaldi would use you to find her. She said you could never lie convincingly about someone you loved. A broken laugh escaped Elena. She was right. Yes. And you were excellent at it. That finally cut through him. Luca looked away. Elena pressed the photograph against her chest as if paper could become a person. Where did you send her? At first Wisconsin, then Canada, then back into the United States under another identity. Where? I will tell you when we are out of this room. Tell me now. Not while Rinaldi is inside our security system. Our? Luca's expression shifted. Elena laughed again, bitterly. There is no hour. A muscle in his jaw tightened. Fine, my security system. She looked at the photograph. Claire appeared thinner than Elena remembered. Her hair was darker, but it was her smile, or the ghost of it. The timestamp was real enough to destroy everything Elena thought she knew. 6 days ago, she whispered. You said she missed a check-in 6 days ago. Yes. And you didn't tell me. No. Why? Because I did not know whether she had simply changed location. Or been taken. Yes. And tonight Rinaldi sends me this. Yes. Elena looked at him. He has her. Luca did not lie. Possibly. The emergency lights blinked. A burst of gunfire echoed somewhere above them. Luca raised the radio. Gabriel. Static. Gabriel, answer me. Nothing. Then 3 quick clicks came through the speaker. Luca's expression sharpened. What does that mean? Elena asked. He can't speak. Is he hurt? 3 clicks means compromised position. Luca moved to the bank of monitors and brought up the west corridor. 2 guards lay on the floor. The west salon doors stood open. The room was empty. Every suspect had vanished. How? Elena whispered. Someone overrode the lockdown. I thought only you could do that. Me and 1 other person. Gabriel? Luca's face hardened. No. He drew his gun. Vittorio. The name hung between them. Elena remembered Vittorio looking at the divorce papers. Domestic disagreement. A heading seen from 12 feet away, or a conversation heard through a hidden microphone hours earlier. Your uncle? He designed this house with my father. Then why did you lock him in with the others? Because I wanted to see whether anyone would try to get him out. Did they? Luca stared at the empty salon on the screen. He got everyone out. A shadow crossed the camera. Then Gabriel stumbled into view. 1 hand pressed to his side. Blood darkened his shirt. Elena forgot everything except the nurse she used to be. He's hit. Luca was already opening the steel door. You stay behind me. I can help him. You can help him after I get you there alive. They moved through the cellar corridor under red emergency lights. The house that had once felt absurdly large now felt claustrophobic, every doorway a possible ambush. Luca kept Elena behind his left shoulder, gun angled low, his pace controlled. At the stairs, a shot punched into the wall inches from his head. He fired twice without hesitation. A man dropped behind the railing above. Elena flinched. Luca did not look at the body. Move! They reached the West Hall. Gabriel had collapsed against a marble column. Elena ran to him. Luca swore under his breath but covered the corridor while she dropped to her knees. Gabriel, look at me. His face was gray. Mrs. Moretti? Not now. She pulled his hand away from his side. Entry wound, right lower abdomen. Did it exit? No. Damn it. She pressed both hands over the wound. Gabriel grunted. Sorry. You always say that right before hurting someone. he muttered. Elena almost smiled. Good. If you can complain, you can stay awake. Luca glanced back. Can he move? Not far? We have a medical room on this floor. I know. Of course she knew. Luca had built it after the second year of their marriage because Elena once complained that every Moretti emergency ended with an illegal doctor being summoned at 3 in the morning. At the time, she had joked that only a criminal would install a private trauma bay next to a ballroom. Luca had replied, only a criminal married to a nurse. The memory stabbed unexpectedly. 2 guards appeared at the far end of the hall. Elena recognized one, Nico Bellini, Gabriel's deputy. Nico! Luca called. Nico raised his weapon, not toward Luca, toward Elena. Luca moved faster. He stepped in front of her as the first shot fired. The bullet struck him high in the shoulder and spun him half around. Elena screamed his name. Luca fired back. Nico dropped. The second guard ran. Luca did not chase him. He turned immediately to Elena. Are you hit? She stared at the blood spreading through his shirt. You are. I asked about you. I'm not hit. Good. Only then did he look at his own shoulder. You're bleeding. I've done it before. This is not the time to be arrogant. It is never the time, according to you. Luca. His knees flexed once. Elena caught his arm. He looked down at her hand gripping him. She nearly let go. Didn't. Medical room, she said. We take Gabriel first. You both go. He began to argue. Elena gave him the look that used to silence drunk patients twice his size. Do not make me sedate you. Something almost human crossed his face despite the blood. You said that the night we met. We did not meet that night, apparently. The softness vanished. He nodded once. Fair. They got Gabriel into the medical room and barricaded the doors. Elena cut away his shirt, packed the wound, started fluids, and used the portable ultrasound Luca had bought after she once mentioned it could save a life. She had mocked the expense. Now she silently thanked every paranoid instinct he had ever had. The bullet missed the liver, she said. I think. There's internal bleeding, but not catastrophic yet. Gabriel's eyes drifted. Stay with me. Luca leaned against the counter, pale but upright. Elena pointed at a chair. Sit. I'm fine. You have a bullet in your shoulder. It went through. That does not mean fine. He sat. She cleaned the wound with hands that had stopped shaking the second medicine took over. Luca watched her face. You remember what to do. I was an ER nurse for 8 years. You left 3 years ago. I married a man who made hospital employment a security risk. His eyes lowered. There it was again. That unspoken ledger of things he had taken from her while convincing himself he was giving her safety. Elena threaded a needle. This is going to hurt. I've been shot. Then you are familiar with the concept. She stitched the torn skin while he sat motionless. At the third suture, he said, I never asked you to quit because I thought your work was beneath me. I know. I asked because Rinaldi had your schedule. I know that now. You hated me for it. Yes. I hated myself for it, too. Her hands slowed. Luca did not say things like that. He did not confess. He did not explain regret. He solved problems and buried feelings under expensive suits. Why didn't you tell me? Because if I told you every threat, you would have lived terrified. So you chose for me. Yes. At least you're consistent. I am not defending it. Elena tied off the stitch. That may be the first intelligent thing you have said tonight. His mouth almost curved. Then Gabriel groaned. They both turned. His eyes opened. Boss? I'm here. Nico was working with Vittorio. Luca's face went still. You're sure? I heard them in the service hall. Vittorio said Rinaldi wanted Elena alive. Said the divorce made tonight easier. Elena felt sick. Gabriel swallowed. Vittorio told Nico to open the tunnel and move the family to the old chapel. "Why the chapel?" Luca asked. "There's a second road below it. Your father built it during the federal raids." Luca stared at him. "I didn't know that road existed." "Vittorio did." Gabriel's eyes fluttered. "Stay awake," Elena said. He looked at her. "Mrs. Moretti, there's more." "What?" "Your sister." Elena's heart stopped. "Nico said they already had Claire." Luca stood. Gabriel forced out the next words. "Rinaldi is bringing her to the chapel." Elena moved before anyone could stop her. She crossed the room, yanked open the cabinet where Luca kept emergency firearms, and picked up a compact pistol. Luca stared at her. "What are you doing?" "Going to the chapel." "No. She is my sister. And this is exactly what Rinaldi wants." "I buried her." Elena's voice broke. "I buried an empty coffin while she was alive. I am not sitting behind another locked door while men decide what I'm allowed to know about my family." Luca stepped toward her. "Elena?" "No." She raised the gun, not at him, but enough to stop him. "You do not get to protect me by taking every decision away from me. Not anymore." For a moment they stared at each other, the feared man who had locked every exit in his house, the woman who had finally asked him to open one. Luca's gaze dropped to the pistol, then returned to her face. He reached into the cabinet and took a second gun. "All right." Elena blinked. "All right? You are going." Suspicion narrowed her eyes. And I am going with you. You're wounded." "So is Gabriel. He would still come if you asked him." From the table, Gabriel muttered, "Absolutely not." Elena looked over. "You are not moving." "I was trying to sound loyal." Despite everything, a laugh escaped her. Luca looked at the sound as if he had forgotten it existed. That hurt, too. He turned to the wall cabinet and pulled out a tactical vest. Elena shook her head. "I'm not wearing that." "You are if you are coming with me." "Luca, this is compromise. This is body armor. In my marriage, those have historically been the same thing." She stared at him. He stared back. Then, impossibly, Elena laughed again. It was brief and wrong and edged with tears, but it was real. Luca's face softened for half a heartbeat. Then the radio crackled. Matteo Rinaldi's voice filled the medical room. "Luca, I am growing impatient." Luca picked up the receiver. "What do you want?" "You know what I want. The ledger. And the woman who can open it." Elena frowned. Luca's gaze snapped to her. "What does he mean?" she whispered. Matteo heard her. He laughed. "Oh, Elena, he still hasn't told you the best part." Luca's grip tightened on the radio. "Shut up, Matteo." "Your father was clever. He did not trust paper. The real ledger was encrypted. 2 keys. Claire had one." Elena looked at Luca. "And the second?" she asked. Matteo's voice became almost gentle. "You have been wearing it for 3 years." Elena's gaze dropped to the thin gold chain around her neck. A small oval locket rested against her chest. Her father's locket, the one Luca had found in a box after their wedding and had repaired because the clasp was broken. The one she had worn almost every day since. Her fingers closed around it. Luca went pale. "You knew?" she whispered. "No." For once, she believed him immediately. Matteo laughed again. "Now," he said, "bring me Elena and the locket, and I will let her sister walk out of the chapel." The line went dead. Elena and Luca stared at each other. Then Luca reached for the locket. She stepped back. His hand stopped in midair. "I need to see it." "You need to ask." Something changed in his face. He lowered his hand. "May I?" Elena held his gaze. Then she unclasped the chain herself and placed the locket in his palm. It was the first thing she had willingly given him all night. Luca looked down at it as if it were a live grenade. A hairline seam ran around the edge. He took a small knife from his pocket and gently pried the back loose. Inside, behind her father's faded photograph, was a black microchip no larger than a fingernail. Elena stared. Luca closed his fist around it. "Now we know why they never stopped watching you." "No," Elena said. "Now we know why they are willing to burn this city down to get me." Luca looked at her. His eyes were not cold anymore. They were terrified. And for the first time, Elena understood something she had never understood about his obsession. Luca Moretti did not watch every door because he loved control. He loved control because he had spent years waiting for the one door he could not guard to open and take her from him. It did not excuse what he had done, but it made the shape of his fear finally visible. He put the microchip in his breast pocket. "Stay behind me at the chapel." Elena checked the magazine in her pistol the way Gabriel had taught her 2 years earlier. "No." Luca's eyebrows lowered. "I'll stay beside you." For several seconds, neither moved. Then Luca nodded once. "Beside me." It was the first order of the night that sounded like a promise instead. The old chapel stood at the southern edge of the Moretti estate where the woods met the lake. It had not held a service in 20 years. Rain silvered the stone walls. Wind pushed through the trees hard enough to bend branches toward the ground. The path from the main house had become a river of mud, so Luca took Elena through the glass conservatory and down a narrow maintenance corridor she had never seen. Another secret passage. Another door inside the house she had lived in for 3 years. Under different circumstances, she might have screamed. Tonight, she simply followed him. They stopped beneath the conservatory roof when a flash of lightning illuminated the garden beyond the glass. Luca lifted one hand. Elena froze. 2 men crossed the terrace outside, weapons tucked beneath raincoats. Rinaldi's men. Luca waited until they passed. Elena whispered, "How many?" "Inside the chapel? At least 12. "And us?" "2. "That seems bad." "I have had worse odds." "That is not comforting." "It wasn't intended to be." He reached into his jacket and pulled out the microchip from her locket. Elena watched him wrap it in a square of gauze, then slide it into the inner pocket of her tactical vest. "What are you doing?" "Giving you the key." "You said Rinaldi wants it." "He does." "And he expects you to have it." "Yes." "Then why give it to me?" Luca took a second object from his pocket, a tiny black memory card from one of the medical monitors, almost identical in size. "You're going to give him a fake." "I'm going to see how much he knows." "What if he knows immediately?" "Then we improvise." Elena looked at him. "That is your plan." "It is the part of the plan you need to know." She gave him a warning look. Luca closed his eyes briefly. Right. He had almost done it again, decided what she was allowed to know. When he opened his eyes, he started over. "There are 3 entrances, front doors, vestry door, and the old service tunnel beneath the altar. Vittorio knows all 3. Rinaldi will expect me through the front because he wants theater." "So we give him theater?" "Yes. The service tunnel opens behind the sacristy. If Gabriel can get anyone loyal to us mobile, that is where they will come. If Gabriel is still conscious. If he isn't, we have no backup." Elena nodded. "And Claire?" "First priority." "And the family?" "Second." "And Rinaldi?" Luca looked toward the chapel through the rain. "Last." Elena blinked. 3 years ago, Rinaldi would have been first. Maybe even 3 hours ago. Luca seemed to know what she was thinking. "I am learning." She swallowed. "Slowly." "I've been told." They reached the final door. Luca paused with his hand on the latch. "If this goes wrong, don't. Elena, no goodbye speeches. I wasn't going to make one. You had the face." "What face?" "The face men get in movies right before they say something noble and stupid." For a second he looked offended. Then the storm cracked overhead, and the chapel bells, dead for decades, gave one low metallic groan in the wind. Luca looked at her. "If this goes wrong, I want you to take Claire and run through the east tunnel." "And you?" "I'll follow." That sounded like a lie. It was. She stared at him. He did not apologize. Elena reached up and grabbed the front of his shirt, careful of the wound in his shoulder. "If I have learned anything from you tonight, Luca Moretti, it is that people who love you should not have to survive your noble decisions after you are gone." His eyes fixed on hers. The word love had slipped out before she could stop it. Neither of them moved. Rain hammered the glass above. Luca's hand rose slowly toward her face. He stopped a fraction of an inch from her cheek, always stopping, always asking without words when the rest of his life was built on command. Elena closed the distance herself. His fingertips touched her skin. It was not a kiss. It was worse. A gentle touch from a man who had spent the night proving how dangerous his hands could be. His thumb moved once beneath her eye. Then Elena stepped back. "Beside me," she said. Luca nodded. "Beside you." They entered through the front doors. The chapel was lit by hundreds of candles. Someone had arranged them deliberately along the aisle and across the old altar, turning the abandoned church into a stage of gold light and black shadow. Rain leaked through holes in the roof. Water dripped between broken pews. Matteo Rinaldi stood at the altar in a midnight blue suit. He was younger than Elena expected, early 40s perhaps, handsome in a polished way that made his smile worse. Beside him stood Vittorio Moretti. Luca's uncle did not look ashamed. 10 armed men lined the walls. Luca's relatives and house staff knelt between the pews under guard, and Claire sat in a wooden chair near the altar. Alive. Elena stopped walking. Everything else disappeared. Claire's hair was darker and cut to her shoulders. A bruise marked one cheek. Her wrists were bound in front of her. She looked older than the sister Elena had buried, thinner around the face, but her eyes were the same, blue-gray, their father's eyes. "Elena," Claire breathed. The pistol nearly slipped from Elena's hand. "Claire." Her sister made a sound between a laugh and a sob. Elena took one step forward. Luca's hand touched the back of her vest, not stopping her, reminding her. Rinaldi smiled. "Family reunions are beautiful, aren't they?" Elena looked at him with hatred so clean it steadied her. "Untie her." "Soon. Now." Rinaldi's smile widened. "Luca, I understand the fascination." Luca's voice was flat. "Say another word about my wife and this negotiation ends." Elena glanced at him. "My wife." The phrase should have made her angry. Instead, in that room, surrounded by men who viewed her as leverage, it sounded like a shield he had chosen to hold in public, even after promising to let her leave in private. Vittorio stepped down from the altar. "You always did mistake possession for strength," he told Luca. Luca looked at the man who had helped raise him. "And you always mistook disloyalty for intelligence." Vittorio smiled without warmth. "You were a better boss before her." Elena felt Luca go still beside her. Vittorio continued, "Before Elena, you understood that fear is more reliable than affection. Then you started canceling meetings because she had a fever. You pulled crews from profitable routes because she volunteered at clinics nearby. You refused a port expansion because it would have put Rinaldi's men 3 blocks from her foundation." Rinaldi looked amused. Vittorio's eyes settled on Elena. "You made him weak." "No," Elena said. "You just discovered he had something you couldn't buy." Vittorio's expression hardened. Luca's gaze flicked to her. A spark of something fierce and private passed through it. Vittorio said, "Do you know how easy it was to make you ask for a divorce?" Elena's blood cooled. He reached into his vest and produced the brass key to the surveillance room. The original. The one Elena had found in the wine cellar had been a duplicate. "I left the service key where the housekeeper would find it," he said. "I knew she would apologize by placing it on your desk. I knew curiosity would do the rest." Luca's face turned murderous. "You wanted her to find the room." "I wanted her to see what you are." "No," Elena said quietly. "You wanted me angry enough to leave without security." Vittorio smiled. "You were supposed to walk out at midnight. Doyle would fire into the east corridor, everyone would panic, and Nico would take you through the service door. Your scarf would be found outside. By sunrise, the city would hear that Luca Moretti's wife had abandoned him. And Rinaldi would have me. For a few hours." Elena looked at Claire. Long enough to trade us for the ledger." Vittorio's smile faded. Claire spoke for the first time. "He was going to kill us afterward." Rinaldi looked at her. "Claire, please, you make me sound unreasonable." "You poisoned our father." Elena's grip tightened on her weapon. There it was. Confirmation. Rinaldi did not bother denying it. "Your father stole from mine." "He stole evidence of murder and trafficking," Claire snapped. "Semantics." Luca's voice dropped. "You are finished." Rinaldi laughed. "You locked your own fortress around my men, Luca. Half your security answers to Vittorio. Your uncle is standing beside me. Your wife wants to divorce you. Your family is on its knees." He spread his hands. "Which part of this looks like my ending?" Luca looked around the chapel. Then he smiled. Elena had seen Luca smile at her. She had seen him smile at children, once at a puppy that had bitten his shoelace, and exactly twice at Gabriel's dry jokes. She had never seen him smile at an enemy. It was terrifying. "The part," Luca said, "where you needed Vittorio to tell you how my house works." Vittorio's face shifted. Rinaldi's smile vanished. Luca continued. "He told you about the tunnel, the locks, the guard rotation. He told you Elena would leave at midnight. He gave you every advantage." His eyes went to his uncle. "But he did not tell you one thing." "What?" Rinaldi asked. "Vittorio has been lying to you too." Silence. Vittorio turned. "Luca." "You opened offshore accounts 3 months ago," Luca said. "Not in Rinaldi's network. In Malta. You moved money from both families." Vittorio's face went blank. Elena realized Luca had suspected him before tonight. Maybe not the betrayal, but something. Rinaldi slowly looked at Vittorio. "What is he talking about?" Vittorio said. "He is buying time." Luca took the fake chip from his pocket and held it between 2 fingers. "No, I am telling you the truth for free. You should appreciate the novelty." Rinaldi's eyes locked on the chip. "There it is. Claire walks first." Rinaldi's smile returned. "You are not in a position to negotiate." Luca looked at Elena, then at Claire, then back at Rinaldi. "All right." Elena turned sharply. Luca tossed the fake chip onto the stone floor midway between them. Every eye followed it. "What are you doing?" Elena whispered. "Choosing." Rinaldi's brows lifted. Luca spread his empty hand. "You want the ledger? Take it. Take the ports. Take the accounts. Take every shell company attached to my name. Burn my organization to the ground if that makes you feel powerful." Vittorio stared at him. Rinaldi's expression turned cautious. Luca's voice did not change, but Elena and Claire walk out. Elena felt something inside her break open. The Moretti empire had been built over 3 generations. Luca had buried friends for it, fought wars for it, lost his father to it. He was offering it without hesitation. For her, and he still did not know the real chip was against her heart. Rinaldi stepped down from the altar. "You expect me to believe you would trade everything for a woman who just asked you for a divorce?" Luca looked at Elena. "I would trade it because she asked." The chapel went silent. "She spent 3 years paying the price for my enemies," he said. "She does not pay another minute." Elena could not breathe. Rinaldi studied him, looking for deception. Claire looked at Elena. Her eyes filled. Vittorio looked disgusted. "There," he said. "That is exactly what I mean. Weak." Luca turned toward him. "No." His voice was calm. "Weak was needing every room locked before I could feel safe. Weak was believing control could replace trust. Weak was lying to the one person whose opinion of me mattered because I was afraid the truth would make her leave." Elena's throat closed. Luca did not look away from Vittorio. "Giving her the choice is the first strong thing I have done in years." Vittorio's face twisted. He drew his gun. Everything happened at once. Claire shouted. Rinaldi lunged for the chip. Elena saw a reflection in the broken stained glass window above the altar, a tiny red dot sliding across Luca's chest. "Down!" she screamed. She hit Luca from the side. A rifle shot cracked from the choir loft. The bullet struck the stone where his heart had been. Luca fired upward. Candles exploded as men scattered. The chapel erupted into gunfire. Elena dropped behind a pew. Luca landed beside her, one arm over her shoulders. "Are you hit?" he demanded. "No." "Claire?" Across the aisle, Claire had thrown herself and the chair sideways behind the altar. "Alive!" she shouted. Luca fired twice toward the north wall. One of Rinaldi's men ducked behind a column. Vittorio disappeared into the smoke and candlelight. Rinaldi grabbed the fake chip and ran toward the vestry. "Let him go!" Elena shouted. Luca looked at her. "The real one is here." She slapped the front of her vest. Understanding flashed across his face, then fury. "You kept it on you? You gave it to me. That was before bullets. This is not the time." Even now, his expression said they were absolutely going to have this argument later. A man rushed to the end of the pew. Elena saw him first. She fired once. The shot hit his thigh and dropped him. Luca stared at her. "What?" "You said beside you." He almost laughed. Then 3 shots punched through the pew above their heads. The rear chapel door burst open. Gabriel stood there, one hand pressed to his bandaged abdomen, 6 loyal guards behind him. Elena's mouth fell open. "You are supposed to be lying down." Gabriel grimaced. "I was bored." Luca shouted, "Get Claire!" His men pushed into the chapel. The balance changed instantly. Rinaldi's shooters retreated toward the south passage. Elena ran to the altar and cut Claire's wrists free with Luca's knife. The second the rope fell, the sisters stared at each other. Then Claire threw her arms around Elena. The sound that came out of Elena was not a word. It was 2.5 years of grief breaking apart in one breath. Claire held her face. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." "You're alive. I tried to keep you safe. You're alive." For one suspended second, the gunfire receded. Elena pressed her forehead to Claire's. Then Claire's eyes widened. "Elena!" A gun barrel touched the back of Elena's head. Vittorio stood behind her. "Enough," he said. Luca stopped 10 feet away. His pistol was pointed at Vittorio, but he could not fire. Vittorio pulled Elena back against him. "Drop it." Luca's eyes went to Elena, not the gun, not his uncle, her. "Luca, don't," she said. Vittorio pressed the barrel harder. "Drop it." Luca lowered his weapon to the floor. Vittorio smiled. "That easily." Luca straightened. "Yes. You really are lost." "No." Luca's eyes never left Elena's face. "I know exactly where I am." Vittorio began backing toward the side door with Elena. "Tell your men to stand down." Luca did. Gabriel cursed under his breath but lowered his weapon. Vittorio's smile widened. Elena felt the real microchip beneath her vest. He did not know she had it. Maybe Rinaldi did not know yet either. Vittorio whispered near her ear, "You destroyed him." Elena looked at Luca. Blood stained his shoulder. Rainwater darkened his hair. Candle smoke moved around him in the ruined church. He looked dangerous. He looked exhausted. He looked afraid. For her. "No," Elena said. Vittorio frowned. "I taught him the difference between loving someone and owning them." Then she drove her heel down on Vittorio's foot and threw her head backward into his face. His gun jerked away. Claire slammed a broken piece of wood into his wrist. The pistol fell. Elena dropped. Luca moved. One shot. Vittorio collapsed against the stone wall, wounded in the shoulder, his weapon out of reach. Luca crossed the distance in seconds. He kicked the gun away and stood over the man who had raised him. Vittorio looked up, breathing hard. "Do it," he said. Luca's pistol remained steady. "You think she changed you," Vittorio sneered. "Prove me wrong." The old Luca would have fired. Everyone in the chapel knew it. Elena knew it. Luca looked at Vittorio for a long time. Then he lowered the gun. "Gabriel." Gabriel approached. "Take him alive." Vittorio laughed bitterly. "Mercy?" Luca looked at him with no warmth at all. "No, testimony." Gabriel hauled Vittorio to his feet. Claire exhaled shakily. Elena turned toward Luca. Before either could speak, one of the guards shouted from the vestry, "Rinaldi is gone!" Luca looked toward the dark passage. A second guard appeared. He took a vehicle from the lower road, heading east toward the harbor. Claire's face changed. "The key." Elena looked at her. "What?" Claire patted her torn coat, panic rising. "He took my key." The first half of the ledger. Luca's eyes went to Elena's vest. She pulled out the real chip. Claire stared at it. "Dad's second key." "Yes. If Rinaldi gets both into the same system, he can erase the ledger and drain every account tied to it." "How long would that take?" Luca asked. "Minutes." Elena looked toward the storm outside. "Then he is not running away." Claire's face went pale. "He is going to his harbor server." Luca picked up his gun. Gabriel stepped forward. "Boss, you've been shot." "So have you." "That is my point." Elena took Luca's arm. He looked at her. "We end this," she said. He hesitated, not because he doubted the danger, because he was finally asking himself whether he had the right to bring her into it. Elena saw the question and answered it. "I am choosing to go." Luca nodded. That was all. Outside, engines roared to life. For the first time since midnight, the iron gates of the Moretti estate opened, and Elena walked through them because she wanted to. The Moretti convoy reached the harbor at 3:38 in the morning. Chicago had disappeared behind rain and low fog. Sodium lights burned along the freight yards. Cargo cranes rose over the lake like enormous black skeletons. The pavement between warehouses reflected red brake lights and the cold white sweep of security lamps. Elena sat in the back of the lead SUV beside Luca. Claire rode behind them with Gabriel, who had ignored 3 separate orders from Elena to return to the medical room. No one had mentioned that Luca was also ignoring medical advice. Elena had learned to choose her battles. For the moment, Luca stared through the windshield at Dock 19. A renovated shipping terminal stood at the end of the pier, all smoked glass and steel. Rinaldi Maritime Solutions glowed in discreet silver letters above the entrance. "Of course he put his name on it," Elena muttered. Luca glanced at her. "You find that arrogant? I married a Moretti who monogrammed the towels in his private jet. They were a gift. From you to yourself." He looked away. "I was 29. Elena stared at him. "Is that your defense?" "No." For one impossible second, sitting in an armored car on the edge of a mafia war, Elena wanted to laugh. Then Luca's phone vibrated. A video opened automatically. Matteo Rinaldi stood inside the terminal's upper control room. Behind him, rows of server cabinets blinked blue through glass walls. In one hand, he held a metal key the size of a matchbook. Claire's half of the ledger. 5 minutes, he said to the camera. Bring me Thomas Hale's second key. Come alone, Elena, or I start deleting everything your father died to protect. The video ended. Elena looked at Luca. No. She blinked. I haven't said anything. You were about to say you are going in alone. I was not. You had the face. What face? The noble and stupid one. Despite herself, Elena smiled. It vanished when Luca reached for her vest and pulled the real microchip free. He held it in his palm. This ends tonight. Yes, but not by giving Rinaldi what he wants. Claire's voice came through the radio from the SUV behind them. There is another option. Luca picked up the receiver. Talk. My half isn't just a key. It is a physical authentication token. Elena's chip is the second. If I can get both into the terminal's internal network at the same time, I can unlock Dad's archive and push it to a federal dead drop. Elena turned in her seat. Federal? Claire hesitated. Luca closed his eyes briefly. You worked with the Bureau. I tried local police first. We know how that ended. Elena looked between them. Did Luca know this too? No, Claire said quickly. He knew I was building a case. He did not know who my contact was. Luca's expression said he disliked this information intensely. Elena almost enjoyed that. How long have you had a federal contact? She asked. 18 months. And the dead drop? Automatic distribution to 3 federal offices and 2 investigative reporters if I authenticate both keys. Luca turned toward the rain-streaked window. Your father was thorough. He learned not to trust one institution, Claire said. So he trusted redundancy. Elena felt a sudden ache for a man who had known he might die and still spent his final months building a way for his daughters to finish what he started. What happens to Luca if the archive goes public? She asked. Silence answered. Luca looked at her. Claire said, There are Moretti accounts in it. Elena's heart tightened. How many? I don't know. Dad's files were 7 years old. Some could still exist. Luca's expression did not change. Send it. Elena stared at him. Claire said, Luca, send all of it. It could expose your family. I heard you. Assets could be frozen, businesses investigated, people arrested. Luca looked at Elena. I said all of it. There was no performance in his face, no calculation. He had offered his empire in the chapel to save them. Now he was offering it again when Rinaldi was not there to hear. That mattered more. Elena whispered, Why? Luca's gaze held hers. Because your father died trying to get the truth out. Because Claire lost 2.5 years of her life hiding. Because you lost those years believing she was dead. His eyes dropped to the microchip in his hand. And because I am done asking you to pay for the world I chose. Elena looked away before he could see how much that hurt, or how much it healed. Gabriel's voice came over the radio. We have movement on the roof. Helicopter crew. Rinaldi plans to leave. Luca checked his weapon. Then we move now. He opened the door. Elena caught his wrist. He turned. Beside me, she said. A different man might have argued. Luca nodded. Beside me. The first shots came before they reached the terminal entrance. Glass burst from the second floor. Luca pulled Elena behind the engine block of a parked truck as Gabriel's men returned fire from the SUVs. Rain whipped sideways beneath the floodlights. Claire crawled from the second vehicle carrying a small laptop in a waterproof case. Elena shouted, You are supposed to stay down! Claire shouted back, You first! They looked at each other. For the first time since the chapel, Elena saw the sister she remembered, stubborn, infuriating, alive. Luca pointed toward a side-loading door. That entrance connects to the server level. Claire nodded. If we can get inside. A bullet struck the truck above Elena's head. Luca shoved her lower. Go with Claire. Elena looked at him. Where are you going? To make sure everyone with a gun looks at me. That is a terrible plan. It is a very effective plan. You were shot 40 minutes ago. Twice tonight, technically. That does not improve your argument. His eyes met hers. Trust me for 60 seconds. The request silenced her. Not obey me. Trust me. Elena nodded once. 60. Luca looked at Gabriel. The older man gave him a grim smile. Then both men broke cover in opposite directions. Gunfire followed them immediately. Elena and Claire ran. They reached the side door while the entire harbor seemed to erupt behind them. Claire produced a stolen access badge from her pocket. Elena stared. Where did you get that? Rinaldi's coat. When? Church. You were tied to a chair. I multitask. The light flashed green. The door unlocked. They entered a dark loading corridor and sprinted up 2 flights of metal stairs. At the server level, alarms pulsed red across the ceiling. Claire opened the laptop as they moved. I need his token first. Which he is carrying. Yes. So the plan is still incomplete. It is developing. You have been spending too much time with Luca. Claire stopped so suddenly Elena nearly hit her. I have something to tell you. Now? If we die in the next 10 minutes, I'm going to be furious with myself. Elena's breath caught. Claire looked at her. Luca did not agree to keep me hidden because he wanted leverage over you. I know. No. You don't. Footsteps sounded somewhere below. Claire spoke faster. When I called him after the crash, he told me he would bring you to me. I begged him not to. He said you would hate him if he lied to you. Elena's throat tightened. What did you say? I told him hate was survivable. Claire's eyes filled. Death wasn't. Elena looked away. He should have told me later. Yes. He should have trusted me. Yes. But the first lie was mine. Elena's anger tried to rise and could not find the same shape anymore. Claire touched her arm. I'm sorry. A door slammed open at the end of the corridor. Rinaldi stood there. He was no longer smiling. Touching, he said. 2 men flanked him. Claire shut the laptop. Rinaldi lifted his gun. Give me the chip. Elena stepped in front of Claire. You first. Rinaldi held up Claire's metal token. You mean this? Yes. He laughed. Your husband is rubbing off on you. He is not my husband for much longer. The statement hurt more now than it had in the study. Rinaldi noticed. Of course he did. Still leaving him? That is none of your business. You know, men like Luca never change. Elena's eyes narrowed. Rinaldi continued. He will tell you he learned. He will open a door. Then the first time he is afraid, he will lock 10 more. Maybe once those words would have worked. Now Elena thought of Luca placing the real chip in her hand, asking permission to touch her locket, offering the truth even when it could destroy him, opening the estate gates. Not perfection. Choice. Maybe, Elena said, but you will never know. Rinaldi frowned. Because men like you think fear and love are the same thing. She saw movement through the glass wall behind him, a dark figure descending from the upper catwalk. Luca. Rinaldi did not see him. Elena kept talking. You killed my father because he stopped being afraid of you. Rinaldi's face hardened. You tried to kill Claire because she stopped being afraid. Luca moved closer. And tonight, Elena said, you made the same mistake with me. Rinaldi understood half a second too late. Luca hit the first guard from behind. Claire threw the laptop case at the second. Elena lunged for Rinaldi's hand. The gun fired into the ceiling. The token fell. Claire dove for it. Rinaldi slammed Elena against the glass wall. Pain flashed through her shoulder. Then Luca was there. He tore Rinaldi away from her and drove him across the control room. The 2 men hit a desk hard enough to shatter a monitor. Elena grabbed the fallen gun and kicked it under the server cabinet. "Claire! I have it!" Claire shoved the metal token into a port on the side of her laptop. "Elena, the chip!" Elena reached into her vest. Nothing. Her heart stopped. She searched the pocket again, and empty. No. Claire looked up. "What?" "It's gone." Across the room, Rinaldi laughed. He broke away from Luca and held up the tiny black microchip between two fingers. He had taken it when he slammed Elena against the wall. Luca's face changed. Rinaldi ran for the roof stairwell. Luca chased him. "Elena, stay with Claire." She ignored him. "Of course she did," Claire muttered, grabbing the laptop and following. They climbed 3 flights into the storm. The rooftop helipad was a circle of violent white light surrounded by darkness. A helicopter idled at the far end, rotors cutting rain into silver sheets. Rinaldi ran toward it. Luca emerged behind him. "Matteo!" Rinaldi turned and fired. Luca staggered. Elena screamed. He dropped to one knee, one hand pressed to his side. Rinaldi kept moving. Elena reached Luca first. Blood spread between his fingers. "Look at me." His face was white beneath the rain. "Chip," he said. "I don't care about the chip." "Elena," I said, "look at me." His eyes focused on hers. Claire sprinted past them after Rinaldi. Gabriel and 2 guards burst onto the roof from the opposite stairwell. Rinaldi reached the helicopter. The pilot looked at the guns aimed across the roof, raised both hands, and climbed out the other side. Rinaldi swore and turned. He had nowhere left to go. Lake Michigan churned black beyond the edge. Gabriel raised his weapon. "Put it down." Rinaldi looked at Luca on the ground, then at Elena kneeling over him. He smiled one final time. "You see?" he shouted over the rotors. "He bleeds like everyone else." Elena pressed harder against Luca's wound. Luca's mouth twitched. "Apparently," he said weakly, "this surprises him." "Save your breath." "I have plenty." "You are lying." "Yes." Claire approached Rinaldi from the side. "Give me the chip." Rinaldi looked at her. Then he threw it toward the edge of the roof. Claire lunged. The chip skittered across wet concrete and stopped inches from the drop. Rinaldi used the distraction to run. Gabriel tackled him before he reached the stairwell. The 2 men crashed to the ground. A guard kicked Rinaldi's gun away. Seconds later, he was on his knees with his hands restrained behind him. Claire crawled to the edge and closed her fingers around the chip. She stared at it, then at Elena. "We have both." "Do it," Luca said. Claire opened the laptop beneath the awning of the rooftop access door. She inserted both keys. The screen filled with lines of encrypted text. A password prompt appeared. Claire looked at Elena. "Dad left a clue." "What clue?" Claire read the words on the screen. "First thing they taught each other." Elena stared. Then she laughed through tears. "No way." "What?" Luca asked. Elena typed 6 letters. Sunday. The day Thomas Hale had taught Elena to make pancakes. The day Elena had taught Claire to ride a bicycle. The day their family always came back together no matter how busy life became. The archive opened. Claire hit send. A progress bar moved across the screen. 10%, 30, 50. Rinaldi stopped struggling. His face finally lost all color. 75. Luca watched from the wet concrete, Elena's hands pressed against his wound. 99. Complete. Claire closed the laptop. "It's gone." Rinaldi stared at her. "What is?" Gabriel asked. "Everything," Claire said. "Every account, every name, every route, every payment." She looked at Luca. "Moretti files too." Luca nodded. "Good." Sirens sounded in the distance. Not Moretti cars, federal vehicles. Claire's dead drop had carried a location beacon with it. Rinaldi began laughing. It was not amused anymore. "You think they're coming for me?" he said. "They're coming for all of you." Luca looked at him. "Then I suggest you get comfortable." Rinaldi's laughter stopped. Elena looked down. Luca's eyes were closing. No, stay with me. I'm awake. You are not allowed to sleep. You sound like the first night. Luca. His gaze found hers again. Rain ran down his face. His voice dropped so only she could hear. I opened the door. Elena's throat tightened. Yes, you can go. She pressed her hand harder against his side. I know. His eyes began to close. Elena leaned closer. And right now, I am choosing to stay. His eyes opened one last time. Something in his face broke. Not weakness, relief. Then Luca Moretti lost consciousness in her arms, while federal sirens filled the harbor and dawn began to turn the Black Lake gray. Luca woke 31 hours later in a private hospital room with 2 armed federal agents outside the door and Elena asleep in a chair beside his bed. His first word was, "Gabriel?" Elena opened her eyes. For a second, she forgot everything except relief. Then she remembered she was still angry with him. "Alive," she said. "Annoying everyone. The surgeon expects a full recovery." "Claire? Safe? You?" She sat up straighter. "Still angry." The faintest hint of a smile touched his mouth. "Good. Why is that good?" "Angry people pay attention." She glared at him. "You almost died and somehow became more irritating." "Talent." His voice was weak, but it was his voice. Elena looked down at her hands. They had scrubbed Luca's blood from her skin hours ago. She could still feel it there. The hospital room was quiet except for rain ticking against the window and the soft pulse of the monitor beside his bed. Luca followed her gaze. "Rinaldi?" "In federal custody. Vittorio, too." "Doyle?" "Talking." He nodded. "The archive?" "Every federal office Claire chose received it. So did the reporters." "Moretti files?" "Yes." His expression did not change. "Lawyers?" "Already circling the building like expensive vultures." "That sounds right." Elena watched him. "Your accounts are being reviewed." "I assumed. 2 shipping companies have been frozen." "I assumed that too. The port contracts might be gone." Luca turned his head toward the window. "All right. That's all you have to say? What would you prefer?" "I don't know. Something dramatic. You built half your life around those businesses." "No." He looked back at her. "I built half my life around believing I could control every outcome." A long pause. "Turns out I was wrong." Elena swallowed. He shifted slightly and pain crossed his face. She stood instinctively. "Don't move." "I was reaching for water." "Oh." She poured it for him and held the cup while he drank. When she set it down, their fingers brushed. Neither moved away immediately. Then Elena stepped back. Luca noticed. Of course he did. "I meant what I said before the chapel," he told her. Her chest tightened. "About what?" "The divorce." The words sounded strange in the bright hospital room after everything that had happened. Elena sat again. "You were bleeding when you said that." "I was not bleeding when you first asked." "You said no then." "Yes." "Why?" Luca looked at the ceiling for a moment. "Because I panicked." Elena almost laughed. "You stared at me for 3 minutes and said one word. That was panic. That is the coldest panic I have ever seen." "I have a reputation." Despite herself, she smiled. It faded quickly. Luca's voice lowered. "When you put those papers on my desk, I knew the message from Rinaldi meant you were in danger. But before I thought about the message, before I thought about the house, before I thought about anything else..." He stopped. "What?" "I thought you were leaving me." Elena's throat tightened. "And I discovered that there are things I am not calm about." She looked at him. The monitor kept its steady rhythm. Luca went on. "I wanted to tear the papers in half." "I figured." "I wanted to lock the study door." "You locked the entire house 10 minutes later." "For a different reason." "Mostly." His mouth tightened. Mostly. That honesty mattered. I wanted to tell you that you could hate me from inside the marriage just as easily as outside it. That sounds like you. I know. He looked at her ringless hand. But wanting something does not give me the right to make it true. Elena said nothing. I have spent years confusing the ability to stop someone with the right to stop them. He took a careful breath. I don't want to do that to you again. Again. Not anymore. Again. The difference was small and enormous. Elena looked toward the window. I don't know what I want now. You don't have to. That is a very patient answer for you. I am heavily medicated. She laughed. This time he smiled too. Then the smile disappeared. You can take as long as you need. What happens while I decide? Whatever you choose. And security? No hidden surveillance. I said security. I heard you. His eyes held hers. I will give you the threat assessment. You choose what you accept. Elena stared at him. Are you sure you didn't hit your head? I may have. You're going to let me choose my own security detail? Yes. And my own schedule? Yes. And where I live? His jaw tightened. Yes. That one hurt. Yes. She almost smiled again. A knock sounded at the door. Luca's attorney entered carrying a slim leather folder. Elena's stomach dropped. Luca held out his hand. The attorney gave him the folder without speaking. Inside were the divorce papers, the same petition Elena had placed on his desk. Clean copies, no coffee stains, no blood, no rain. Luca accepted a pen. His hand shook slightly from the injury. He signed his name anyway, Luca Antonio Moretti. Then he signed the preliminary property agreement beneath it. Elena watched in silence. He pushed the papers across the hospital tray toward her. No conditions, he said. She looked down. You didn't read the settlement. My attorney did. You are giving me the apartment on Pearson. It was purchased in your name. I didn't know that. I know. And the foundation account. It is yours. I don't want mafia money. It came from the legal hotel company. She looked at the attorney. He nodded cautiously. Elena looked back at Luca. Anything else you secretly put in my name? A bookstore in Boston. Her mouth fell open. Luca winced. That sounded worse out loud. You bought me a bookstore? You said once that if you had another life you would own one. When? On our second date. That was not a date. You had armed men at the next table. I paid for dinner. That is not the definition of a date. I am learning many things this week. Elena covered her face with one hand. She was laughing again. It felt impossible. It also felt necessary. When she lowered her hand, Luca was watching her with an expression that made the room seem quieter. He reached into the folder and removed a small velvet pouch. Elena knew what was inside before he opened it. Her wedding ring. He placed it beside the signed papers. I found it in the surveillance room before we left the house. Elena touched the ring with one finger. Luca looked away. I won't ask you to wear it. The words were barely above a whisper. Keep it, sell it, throw it in the lake. That would be wasteful. It was insured? Of course it was. He closed his eyes for a moment. Elena stood. Where are you going? He asked before he could stop himself. His eyes opened. He heard the old instinct in his own voice. So did she. The room went still. Elena waited. Luca corrected himself. Sorry. She looked at him. I'm going to see Claire. He nodded. Okay. No order. No guard summoned. No question about when she would return. Elena picked up the signed divorce papers. At the door, she glanced back. Luca was staring at the empty space on the tray where the papers had been. He looked more frightened than he had with a gun pointed at him. Elena almost went back. She did not. He needed to let her leave. She needed to know he could. So Elena opened the hospital door and walked through it. Luca did not follow. 6 weeks passed. Spring came late to Chicago. The last dirty ridges of snow disappeared from the sidewalks. Trees along the lake began to turn green. The city moved on from the headlines even while federal subpoenas multiplied behind closed doors. Matteo Rinaldi was indicted on conspiracy, murder, racketeering, and a list of financial crimes long enough to make evening news anchors run out of breath. Vittorio agreed to cooperate after learning Rinaldi planned to blame him for everything. Patrick Doyle confessed to the kidnapping plot. Nico Bellini survived the chapel attack and started talking before he left the hospital. The men who had spent years believing silence made them powerful, discovered that prison made them conversational. Claire entered a protected federal program until the first trials. This time, Elena knew where she was. That changed everything. They spoke every morning at 7 and every night at 10. Sometimes they talked for 2 hours. Sometimes they sat in silence while Claire drank coffee and Elena folded laundry. It was ordinary. Elena had never understood how precious ordinary could feel. She moved into the Pearson apartment Luca had bought in her name. She nearly refused it out of principle until Claire told her that making Luca suffer financially by leaving a multi-million-dollar apartment empty was not the moral victory Elena imagined. Elena returned to St. Catherine's, not to the foundation, to the emergency department. Her license was current. Her instincts returned faster than her confidence. On her first night, a teenager arrived after a motorcycle accident, terrified and trying not to cry. Elena held his hand while the physician reduced his broken wrist. At 4 a.m, she stood in the supply room and cried alone for 5 minutes. Not because she was sad, because some part of herself she thought marriage had erased was still there, waiting. Luca did not call. That surprised her. For 3 years, Luca had known where she was before she did. Now there were no black SUVs across the street, no silent men in the hospital lobby, no driver waiting when her shift ended. On the 3rd night, Elena became so suspicious she walked around the block twice looking for surveillance. There was none. She was offended by how offended she felt. Claire laughed for a full minute when Elena admitted it. "You told him not to watch you." "I know." So he stopped. "I know." "And now you're mad?" "I'm not mad." "You sound mad." "I'm adjusting." Claire smiled at her through the encrypted video call. "You miss him." Elena looked away. "That is not the same as trusting him." "No. I can love someone and still know they are bad for me." "Yes. I can forgive someone and still leave." "Yes." Elena looked back at the screen. "You are being extremely unhelpful." "I was dead for 2.5 years. I'm trying a new thing where I don't make your decisions for you." Elena laughed despite herself. 2 days later, a package arrived at the apartment. No Moretti seal, no note. Inside was her father's file. Every document from the surveillance room had been copied for her. There was also a flash drive containing the full security archive. On top sat the brass key. Elena called Gabriel. He answered on the second ring. "Mrs. Moretti." "Don't call me that." A pause. "Elena, did Luca send this?" "Yes." "Why didn't he include a note?" "He said a note would look like an attempt to influence you." She closed her eyes. "What happened to the room?" Gabriel hesitated. "What?" Elena asked. "You should probably see it yourself." "I am not going back to that house." "Then I did not say anything." Gabriel. "Goodbye, Elena." He hung up. She stared at the phone. Traitor. For 4 more days, she told herself she did not care. On the 5th, she drove to the Moretti estate. No one stopped her at the gate. The iron bars stood open. That unsettled her more than if 20 armed men had appeared. She parked near the main entrance and climbed the steps. The front door opened before she knocked. Gabriel stood there. He was pale but upright, his movements still careful. "I thought you were not coming." "I'm here for the surveillance room." "Of course." "Where is Luca?" Gabriel's expression remained perfectly neutral. "You are here for the surveillance room." Elena glared at him. He stepped aside. The house felt different, not empty, unarmed. There were still security men, of course. It was Luca Moretti's home, but no one shadowed Elena through the corridor. No doors clicked behind her. Gabriel took her downstairs. He stopped outside the hidden steel panel. "It is unlocked." Elena frowned. "Always?" "Now." She pushed the door open. The monitors were gone. The photographs were gone. The files were gone. Every map and route involving Elena had been removed. The room had been stripped to concrete walls and one metal table. On the table sat a shallow steel tray filled with ash. Elena looked at Gabriel. He burned them? Every original photograph, every handwritten report, every copy not required by federal investigators. The digital files? Given to you, deleted from our system after transfer. Elena stared at the ash. Gabriel added, "He removed the interior cameras from the Pearson apartment too." Her head snapped toward him. "There were cameras in the apartment?" "Exterior only." She narrowed her eyes. "Those are gone too." "Good." "Yes." "Did he ask you to tell me any of this?" "No." "Then why are you?" Gabriel considered her. "Because I have worked for Luca since he was 19. I have watched him survive bullets, funerals, betrayals, and federal investigations without changing his breakfast order." Elena almost smiled. Gabriel continued, "In 6 weeks, he has changed every security protocol in this house because you told him protection without consent is still control." "He told you that?" "He made me write it into the manual." Elena laughed before she could stop herself. Gabriel looked faintly offended. "It is a very serious manual." "I'm sure." He also converted 3 Moretti shipping routes into legal contracts, closed the clubs Vittorio used for laundering, and sold the Boston bookstore. Elena's face fell. "He sold it?" "No." Gabriel's mouth twitched. "I wanted to see whether you cared." She stared at him. "You're spending too much time with Luca." "That is probably true." He left her alone with the ashes. Elena stood in the room that had ended her marriage. For the first time, it did not feel like a cage. It felt like evidence of a man dismantling one. On the metal table, beneath the tray, she noticed a folded piece of paper. Her name was written on it, not Moretti, Elena Hale. She opened it. 4 words. "You were right. I'm sorry." No explanation, no excuse, no request to come back. Elena read it twice, then she folded it carefully and put it in her pocket. She found Luca outside by the lake. He stood on the stone terrace with one hand in the pocket of a dark coat, looking toward the water. He was thinner than 6 weeks earlier. His shoulder still moved stiffly. The scar near his ribs was hidden beneath layers of clothing, but Elena knew exactly where it was. He turned when he heard her footsteps. For once, surprise crossed his face before he could hide it. "Elena." "Gabriel said you sold my bookstore." Luca frowned. "I did not." "I know. I may fire him." "He was shot for you." "That complicates things." The wind moved between them. Luca did not come closer. Elena noticed that too. "How are you?" she asked. "Alive." "That is not an answer." "It was your answer for 3 years." She almost smiled. "Fair." He looked at her ringless hand. His face revealed nothing. "Did you file?" he asked. The divorce papers had been sitting in the top drawer of Elena's desk for 6 weeks, signed by both of them, waiting for her. "No." Luca went perfectly still. Elena held up one hand. "Do not read too much into that yet." He exhaled slowly. "All right." "I have conditions." His eyes sharpened. That sounds familiar. Our first marriage was a contract. It was supposed to last 1 year. You kept renewing it emotionally without paperwork. I was hoping you wouldn't notice. I noticed. Elena stepped closer. Condition 1. No surveillance I do not know about. Yes. Condition 2. If there is a threat to me, you tell me. You do not decide what information I can handle. Yes. Condition 3. Claire is never used as a reason to lie to me again. Yes. Condition 4. I work. Yes. At St. Catherine's. Yes. Night shifts if I want them. His jaw tightened. Elena waited. Luca looked toward the lake, then back at her. Yes. She smiled slightly. That one hurt too. Yes. Condition 5. You do not lock me in a room because you are angry. I have never done that. You locked an entire estate. There were kidnappers. Luca, yes. And if I say I need space, you give me space. Yes. And if I ask a question you do not want to answer, I answer it. Truthfully, yes. She studied him. You agreed too fast. I have had 6 weeks to think about this conversation. Oh, I had a list. Elena's brows rose. You had conditions for me? 1. She folded her arms. Let's hear it. Luca stepped closer for the first time, not into her space, only close enough that she could see the faint scar near his temple and the exhaustion beneath his eyes. If you stay, he said, you stay because you want to. Elena's breath caught. No debt, no protection bargain, no fear of what happens if you leave. His voice roughened. No Moretti name unless you choose it. No ring unless you put it on yourself. If you wake up tomorrow and decide this was a mistake, I open the door. The lake crashed against the stones below them. Elena looked at the man who had once believed love meant knowing every road she traveled. Now he was standing still while she decided which direction to walk. She reached into her coat pocket. Luca's eyes dropped to her hand. Elena pulled out the velvet pouch from the hospital. His expression changed. She opened it. The wedding ring caught the gray afternoon light. Luca did not move. Elena took the ring between her fingers. I am not putting this on because the first marriage was good enough. He nodded. It wasn't. I am not putting it on because you got shot for me. Good. And I am not putting it on because I owe you for Claire. You don't. She looked at him. I am putting it on because I still love you. For the first time since she had known him, Luca Moretti lost all control of his face. The feared man of Chicago looked stunned, almost young. Elena slid the ring onto her own finger. His eyes closed. 1 breath, 2. When he opened them, they were bright. She had seen Luca angry, bleeding, ruthless, cold. She had never seen him this close to tears. He looked away as if embarrassed by it. Elena reached for his hand. He let her take it. Don't hide now, she said softly. His fingers closed around hers. I don't know how to do this. Neither do I. That is not reassuring. Good. He laughed under his breath, then he lifted his free hand toward her face and stopped, even now. Elena smiled. Yes. His fingertips touched her cheek. He kissed her slowly, without urgency, without an audience, without a gunshot waiting to interrupt them. For the first time, nothing about the moment felt stolen. When they separated, Elena rested her forehead against his. I am still keeping the signed divorce papers, I assumed, in my desk. That seems threatening. It is. I respect that. You should. They walked back toward the house together. At the terrace doors, Luca reached for the handle. Elena stopped him. He looked at her. Show me something. What? Every exit. For the next 20 minutes, Luca Moretti walked his wife through his own mansion and showed her every way out. The main doors, The kitchen service entrance, the garage access, the conservatory door, the basement tunnel, the old wine cellar passage, the emergency stairs, the concealed route beneath the library. Even the ridiculous dumbwaiter Gabriel claimed was technically large enough for Elena if circumstances became desperate. At every door, Luca handed her a key, a code, or both. When they reached the front hall again, Elena's keyring was heavy in her palm. Luca stood beside the massive oak doors. "Anything else?" she asked. "One." He opened the front door. Cool spring air swept into the hall. The iron gates at the end of the drive were open too. Beyond them waited Chicago, her hospital, her sister, her apartment, her life, every road she could choose. Luca stepped aside. "You can leave." Elena looked at the open door, then at him. 6 weeks earlier, he had locked every exit 10 minutes after she asked for a divorce. Now every exit was open, and he was the one moving out of her way. Elena reached for the door. Luca's face went still. She closed it. Not locked. Just closed. "I know," she said. Then she took his hand and led him back into the house.